The after-action report filed by the surviving commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division in July 1944 contained observations so contrary to German assumptions about enemy capabilities that headquarters initially questioned whether combat stress had compromised the officer's judgment. The Canadian infantry formations opposing German armored units in the Bocage country south of Caen were demonstrating anti-tank effectiveness that exceeded anything German tankers had encountered from British or American forces in similar terrain. The report described Canadian soldiers who moved through hedgerows with uncanny fieldcraft, appearing at close range to destroy tanks with weapons that should have been ineffective against armored vehicles when employed by troops presumed to be inexperienced colonials, barely trained for modern warfare. The Germans had dismissed Canadian forces as rookies who would panic when facing the feared Panzer formations that had dominated battlefields from Poland to France. Yet these supposed amateurs were systematically hunting German tanks with patience and precision that suggested expertise far beyond what their background should have provided. The Norman Bocage presented perhaps the worst possible terrain for armored warfare, as centuries-old hedgerows divided the landscape into countless small fields bordered by earth banks so thick and high that tanks could barely see between compartments and could only move along narrow lanes that became killing zones when properly defended. German forces had hoped to use their armor advantage to compensate for Allied superiority in numbers and firepower, but the terrain negated much of the mobility and range that made tanks effective on open ground. Panzers advancing through Bocage moved slowly and predictably, their crews blind to threats lurking behind the next hedgerow and unable to bring superior optics and gun range to bear when engagement distances measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. The Canadians facing these armored formations understood instinctively how to exploit these conditions in ways that baffled German tankers accustomed to opponents who fought according to doctrine rather than adapting tactics to specific terrain. What German intelligence had failed to discover about the Canadian soldiers hunting their tanks was that significant numbers had grown up in rural and wilderness areas where hunting large and dangerous game represented both subsistence necessity and cultural tradition. Men from the forests of British Columbia and the prairies of Saskatchewan had learned from childhood how to track animals far more alert than any tank crew, how to remain motionless for hours waiting for the perfect shot, and how to read terrain to predict where prey would move before it appeared. These skills translated devastatingly to anti-tank warfare in Bocage country, where patience, fieldcraft, and intimate understanding of terrain mattered more than the industrial firepower that American forces relied on. The Canadians hunted German armor with the same methodical patience they had used tracking deer and bear, treating 70-ton tanks as simply larger and noisier prey that followed predictable patterns once you understood their behavior. The German tankers rolling into battle against these opponents brought their own considerable expertise built through years of armored warfare across multiple theaters. The Panzer crews manning Tigers, Panthers, and Mark III's in Normandy represented the survivors of campaigns in Russia, Africa, and earlier Western Front battles where they had learned their deadly trade against opponents ranging from Soviet mass attacks to British armor formations. These veterans understood their vehicles intimately, knew how to employ armor and firepower effectively, and had developed tactical doctrine refined through hard experience about how to win tank battles. What they had not encountered before were opponents who refused to fight tank battles at all, but instead used infantry tactics adapted from hunting to stalk and kill armored vehicles in terrain where their advantages in armor and guns became liabilities that skilled hunters exploited with ruthless efficiency. The stage was set for a collision between German confidence in armored warfare superiority and Canadian adaptation of hunting skills to modern combat, between doctrine built on open-terrain tank battles and improvised tactics born from intimate knowledge of how predators successfully killed prey far larger and more powerful than themselves. The Germans entered Bocage fighting expecting to face infantry they could suppress with machine guns and high-explosive shells, rookies who would retreat when armor appeared, because inexperienced soldiers feared tanks above all other threats. Instead, they would discover that the Canadians, stalking through hedgerows, treated tanks not as invincible weapons to be feared, but as targets to be hunted with the same patience and precision their grandfathers had used hunting dangerous game in forests where humans were not the apex predators. The hunters had come to Normandy, and the prey wore black uniforms and drove machines that would prove less difficult to kill than their crews believed possible. The Canadian formations moving into the bocage south of Caen in early July 1944 included units drawn from across the vast dominion, bringing together men whose backgrounds spanned urban industrial workers and rural farmers, experienced soldiers who had fought in Italy, and fresh reinforcements seeing their first action. Among these troops walked significant numbers who had grown up in environments where hunting represented not sport, but essential skill for survival and subsistence, in regions where winters were harsh and grocery stores were distant luxuries rather than neighborhood conveniences. These men understood concepts that urban soldiers struggled to grasp: how to move through natural terrain without creating disturbance that alerted quarry, how to read signs in vegetation and ground that revealed where animals had passed and where they would likely appear, and most critically, how to wait with infinite patience for the moment when prey moved into position for a killing shot. The weapons Canadian infantry carried into bocage fighting included standard rifles and machine guns, but also significant numbers of PIAT anti-tank projectors, weapons that launched hollow-charge bombs capable of penetrating even heavy German armor at close range, but required operators to approach within 50 yards of their targets. British and American troops often viewed the PIAT with disdain, considering it heavy, awkward, and suicidally dangerous to employ against tanks that could kill infantry at hundreds of yards with machine guns and main armament. The Canadians with hunting backgrounds recognized the PIAT differently, as essentially a large-bore rifle that fired single powerful shot at close range, exactly the kind of weapon they understood from experience hunting dangerous game where you got one chance to place your shot perfectly or the animal killed you. The mindset required to stalk within 50 yards of a German tank paralleled exactly the approach needed to kill a bear or moose with a rifle, and men who had done the latter found the former less psychologically daunting than soldiers who had never hunted anything more dangerous than pigeons in city parks. Training for anti-tank warfare in Canadian units incorporated lessons learned through Mediterranean campaigns where soldiers had developed effective techniques for tank hunting in terrain that negated German armor advantages. Veterans who had fought in Sicily and Italy taught new troops how to identify tank movement patterns, where to position themselves in terrain to maximize ambush opportunities, and critically how to remain motionless and silent while armor passed within feet of concealed positions. For soldiers with hunting backgrounds, this training simply formalized instincts they had developed through years of fieldcraft, translating knowledge about stalking deer into doctrine for stalking panzers. Officers running these training sessions noted that rural troops from farming and wilderness regions learned anti-tank tactics faster than urban soldiers and displayed confidence that bordered on eagerness when discussing getting close to enemy armor, an attitude that disturbed men who had seen what tank guns did to infantry caught in the open. The German forces defending south of Caen included elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, a formation composed of young fanatics indoctrinated since childhood in Nazi ideology, and trained to believe themselves superior to enemies they dismissed as mongrel democracies lacking proper fighting spirit. These SS troops expected to break Canadian attacks through combination of ideological fervor, superior equipment, and armor that would terrorize infantry into retreat or surrender. Their tanks, particularly the Tigers and Panthers that represented the pinnacle of German armored design, mounted guns that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was ineffective and carried armor so thick that frontal penetration required exceptional luck or specialized weapons. The crews manning these machines had been taught they were driving invincible weapons that gave Germany qualitative superiority compensating for Allied numerical advantage, and they rolled into combat confident that Canadian infantry would scatter when panzers appeared. The first encounters between German armor and Canadian infantry in the bocage revealed immediately that German assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Panzer columns, advancing along narrow lanes between hedgerows, found themselves under attack from PIAT teams that appeared at ranges where the huge German tanks could not depress their guns low enough to return fire, fired single devastating shots into vulnerable side or rear armor, and vanished into hedgerows before supporting infantry could react. Tank commanders who tried to hunt down these attackers discovered that the Canadians moved through bocage with ghost-like stealth, leaving no trail and reappearing unexpectedly from positions that should have been impossible to reach without detection. German veterans who had fought Soviet infantry in Stalingrad or British troops in Africa found themselves disturbed by opponents who fought with patience that seemed inhuman, lying motionless in concealment for hours waiting for tanks to move into kill zones, then striking with precision that suggested they had studied each vehicle's vulnerabilities in detail. The rookies were hunting the hunters, and the predator-prey relationship the Germans had assumed was reversing in ways that shattered confidence built through years of armored warfare dominance. The killing of Tiger Tank No. 314 became legendary among Canadian infantry as the perfect example of how hunting skills translated into anti-tank effectiveness that German doctrine had no answer for. The massive Tiger had been terrorizing a sector of the Canadian advance for 2 days, its 80 outmaneuvered gun destroying several Shermans and forcing infantry to ground whenever its distinctive engine note announced its presence. German propaganda had made the Tiger into a symbol of invincibility, and Allied soldiers across Normandy had learned to fear the sound of its engine and the crack of its powerful gun that could penetrate any Allied armor from ranges where return fire was futile. The commander of the Tiger in question had become overconfident through days of one-sided combat, advancing along predictable routes and pausing in positions where his superior armor made him feel invulnerable to anything Canadian infantry could bring to bear. A Canadian Piat team, led by a soldier who had grown up hunting grizzly bears in British Columbia, spent an entire night moving into position along a narrow lane where the Tiger had appeared repeatedly during previous days. The team moved with excruciating patience, covering barely 100 yards in 6 hours of crawling through hedgerows and across ditches in darkness, where any noise or visible movement would alert German infantry screening the area. They positioned themselves in a shallow depression barely 20 yards from where the lane curved, a location that would put them at point-blank range when the Tiger rounded the corner, but also left them exposed to German infantry if discovered before the tank appeared. The team then waited through the morning and into afternoon, lying motionless in their hide while German patrols passed within yards and insects crawled over their faces, maintaining absolute discipline because they understood that impatience killed hunters as surely as it spooked game. The Tiger appeared in late afternoon, its commander standing in the turret hatch, scanning the hedgerows ahead, while the massive tank rounded the curve exactly where the Canadians had predicted. The Piat operator waited until the tank's side armor was fully exposed and perpendicular to his position barely 15 yards away, a range where even the crude projector could not miss, and where the hollow charge bomb would have maximum penetration effect. The single shot struck perfectly just below the turret ring where armor was thinner and internal fuel and ammunition were concentrated, the shaped charge jet burning through steel and igniting catastrophic internal explosion that blew the turret completely off the hull and killed the crew instantly. The Canadians were already moving before the turret crashed down, vanishing into hedgerows while German infantry rushed toward the burning wreck, shooting at shadows and finding nothing but an empty depression where the ambush team had waited for hours to take their single perfect shot. German tankers who learned about the Tiger's destruction through radio reports monitoring its distress call felt chill of recognition that the Canadians were employing tactics that violated armor warfare doctrine in ways that made experience and superior equipment irrelevant. A Tiger killed at 15 yards by infantry represented failure of every principle that German armor training emphasized: maintaining standoff distance, coordinating with infantry support, and using superior optics and firepower to destroy threats before they could close. Yet the Canadians had negated all these advantages through patience and fieldcraft that allowed them to dictate engagement range and timing, waiting until the perfect moment to fire, rather than attacking when target appeared and accepting risks that German doctrine considered suicidal. Tank crews who had felt secure in their armored protection now understood they faced opponents who viewed tanks not as weapons to be fought at safe distance, but as prey to be stalked and killed at ranges where armor became coffin rather than protection. The destruction of Tiger 314 was repeated across the bocage throughout July and August as Canadian infantry systematically hunted German armor with techniques that combined modern weapons with ancient hunting skills. Panzer commanders found their units suffering steadily mounting losses to Piat attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Devastating single shots fired from impossible ranges that destroyed tanks and vanished before supporting forces could react. The psychological impact on German tankers exceeded the material losses as crews who had dominated battlefields from Kursk to Caen now drove their vehicles through Norman lanes in constant fear that each hedgerow concealed hunters, waiting with patience, measured in hours for the moment to strike. German armor that had been committed to break Canadian advance instead found itself hunted to the point where tank commanders refused to move without massive infantry support and reconnaissance that slowed operations to crawl and surrendered initiative to opponents who proved far more dangerous than intelligence had predicted. The tactical lessons emerging from Canadian success in hunting German armor filtered through Allied forces, as commanders recognized that troops with specific civilian backgrounds possessed skills directly applicable to defeating enemy strengths. American and British units began requesting Canadian liaison officers to teach anti-tank hunting techniques that had proven so effective in the bocage, though instructors discovered that soldiers without hunting experience struggled to internalize concepts that came naturally to men who had grown up stalking dangerous game. The ability to wait motionless for hours, to move through terrain without creating disturbance, and to read ground for signs of enemy movement represented skills that could be taught only partially through training. The Canadians had brought to Normandy expertise developed over lifetimes in environments where these capabilities meant difference between eating and starving, between surviving encounters with dangerous animals and being killed by prey that fought back. German tactical adaptations to counter Canadian tank hunting proved largely ineffective because they addressed symptoms rather than underlying problem that opponents refused to fight according to doctrine that favored German advantages. Panzer formations increased infantry support and changed movement patterns, attempting to make tank operations less predictable and provide better screening against close-range ambush. These measures slowed German mobility without significantly reducing losses because the Canadians adapted faster than German doctrine could evolve, finding new approaches and positions that exploited whatever tactics the panzers employed. Tank commanders who had spent careers mastering armored warfare found themselves outmaneuvered by infantry who treated each encounter as unique hunting situation requiring adaptation rather than application of standardized techniques. The Germans were trying to fight systematically against opponents who fought instinctively, and institutional doctrine proved no match for skills honed through necessity over generations. The psychological cost on German tankers manifested in deteriorating morale and increasing reluctance to engage Canadian infantry even when circumstances favored armor. Crews who had faced Soviet tanks at Kursk or American Shermans in earlier Normandy fighting found Canadian infantry fundamentally more disturbing because the threat came from unexpected directions, at impossible ranges, delivered by opponents who seemed to materialize from terrain that should have provided no concealment. The fear was primal in ways that combat against other armored forces was not. The awareness that somewhere in the hedgerows ahead, patient men were waiting with weapons specifically chosen to kill you, and willingness to endure hardship that made them more dangerous than enemy tanks or aircraft. German veterans who survived the bocage fighting wrote afterward about the psychological impact of being hunted rather than being hunters, of understanding that their armor and firepower meant nothing against opponents who controlled engagement terms through superior field craft. Strategic implications of Canadian tank hunting success rippled beyond immediate tactical victories to affect German operational planning across the Normandy theater. Armor that should have been available for counterattacks and mobile defense instead was tied down in static positions or refused commitment to combat where Canadian infantry operated because commanders could not accept loss rates that outpaced replacement capacity. The attrition of German armor through steady Canadian hunting degraded Panzer effectiveness more thoroughly than pitched tank battles would have, because losses were continuous and uncompensated by inflicting equivalent damage on opponents who lost primarily infantry easily replaced through reinforcement pipeline. German armor advantage that should have helped offset Allied numerical superiority was bleeding away through death by 1,000 ambushes executed by troops German intelligence had dismissed as inexperienced colonials. Recognition of Canadian anti-tank effectiveness came gradually to Allied high command, who initially attributed German armor losses to air power or conventional anti-tank guns rather than recognizing that infantry with PIATs were accounting for significant proportion of destroyed vehicles. Canadian commanders filing reports emphasized the importance of fieldcraft training and recruiting troops with hunting backgrounds, recommendations that remained largely unimplemented by allies whose urban populations could not replicate the specific skills that made Canadian methods so effective. The expertise resided not in equipment or doctrine, but in soldiers whose civilian lives had prepared them for warfare in ways that no training program could fully replicate, making Canadian tank hunting capability a unique advantage that emerged from national character and geography rather than military innovation that could be standardized across forces. The long-term legacy of Canadian tank hunting in Normandy influenced both tactical doctrine and recruitment preferences for special operations forces that recognized value of specific civilian skill sets in military contexts. Post-war analysis identified fieldcraft, patience, and comfort operating independently in hostile terrain as critical capabilities that hunting experience developed naturally and military training replicated imperfectly at best. Special Forces selection processes began favoring candidates with outdoor backgrounds and hunting experience, recognizing that certain mental attributes required for effective covert operations correlated strongly with skills developed through stalking dangerous game. The hunters who had terrorized German armor in Norman bocage had demonstrated that ancient human capabilities remained relevant in mechanized warfare when properly applied. That technology did not eliminate importance of fundamental skills that predated modern weapons. German military literature examining the Normandy defeat included analysis of Canadian anti-tank tactics that Wehrmacht officers struggled to counter with existing doctrine. The recognition that infantry employing patient stalking techniques could neutralize armor advantages challenged assumptions about combined arms warfare that had dominated German military thinking since successful blitzkrieg campaigns demonstrated tank infantry coordination. Some German officers argued the Canadian success represented exceptional circumstances of bocage terrain that would not apply in open country where armor mobility and range negated close-range ambush tactics. Others recognized more fundamental lesson that opponents who adapted tactics to exploit specific terrain and unit capabilities would defeat forces that relied on doctrinal rigidity regardless of circumstance, a criticism of German military culture that sparked bitter debates about whether Wehrmacht defeat stemmed from material disadvantage or intellectual failure. The individual Canadian soldiers who had hunted German tanks through Norman hedgerows returned to civilian lives carrying memories of combat that blended ancient and modern elements in ways that made their experience difficult to articulate. Men who had stalked bears and elk in peacetime wilderness found themselves having used identical skills to kill human beings in industrialized warfare, creating psychological complexity that few could process easily. Some found hunting after the war impossible because pulling the trigger on an animal triggered flashbacks to tank kills and dying German crews, while others returned to wilderness pursuing game with renewed appreciation for the privilege of hunting for sport rather than survival. The skills that made them deadly soldiers became burdens in peace as memories refused to separate sporting hunts from lethal stalks against human prey. Canadian national identity incorporated the tank hunting exploit selectively, emphasizing tactical effectiveness while generally avoiding detailed discussion of the violence and the blurring of distinctions between hunting animals and hunting men. The stereotype of Canadians as outdoorsmen and hunters received reinforcement from military accomplishments that validated national mythology about frontier heritage and wilderness expertise, though the darker implications of applying hunting skills to human targets remained largely unexplored in popular narratives. Veterans who had done the actual hunting sometimes found the sanitized versions frustrating, feeling that civilian accounts missed the fundamental grimness of what they had experienced in reducing human beings to prey and learning to kill with the same dispassion they had once reserved for game animals. The story of Canadian hunters stalking German tanks through Norman bocage ultimately illustrates how underestimation of opponents based on assumptions about experience and capability creates vulnerabilities that skilled enemies exploit ruthlessly. German tankers who dismissed Canadian infantry as rookies learned too late that their opponents possessed expertise far more dangerous than conventional military experience, that skills developed through civilian necessity translated devastatingly to modern warfare when applied by soldiers who understood both their craft and their enemy. The hunters from Canadian forests and prairies had brought to European battlefields capabilities that German doctrine had no framework to counter, patience and field craft that made the most powerful tanks vulnerable to men willing to stalk them like dangerous game. Those skills won battles and campaigns while remaining fundamentally foreign to opponents who had forgotten or never learned that warfare was fundamentally about killing, and that men trained to kill animals efficiently could adapt those skills to killing soldiers just as effectively when circumstances and terrain allowed. The German realization came too late, paid for in burning tanks and dead crews who had believed armor made them invulnerable to infantry they had dismissed as amateurs. The rookies had been hunters all along, and by the time the Germans understood what that meant, the predator-prey relationship had reversed completely and irreversibly. The men in black tank uniforms were no longer hunting through bocage, but being hunted by opponents who knew patience and fieldcraft better than any military doctrine could teach, and who killed with the calm efficiency of people who understood exactly what they were doing because they had been doing it since childhood. The underestimation that began the campaign ended in acknowledgement, paid in blood and burning steel. The ultimate recognition that came too late to save those who had learned the lesson. Only after becoming prey to hunters, they had dismissed as harmless rookies barely worthy of consideration as serious opponents.